Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Adventures in DevOps. I'm Warren, and here today I have senior staff engineer at Google working on Chrome, who leads the Federated Credential Management (FCM) project, originally from Brazil, I think, and at Google for almost 20 years. Sam Goto, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, nice meeting you. Yeah, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
I think every engineer or anyone who's in the technical domain is probably always has the same question for you, which is your last name. That must break some systems.
Oh, you'd be surprised how many systems I broke at Google. Yes, I am actually Sam Goto. Goto is my last name. It's technically a very popular last name in Japan, although I've been born and raised in Brazil, which surprised a lot of people too. But I am Goto at google.com. I am Goto at chrome.org. And you'd be surprised the amount of systems that I broke, because obviously Goto is a reserved keyword in many computer systems. Yeah, apparently that's my biggest legacy at Google, is like the amount of systems that I broke, is what I'm most famous for, I guess.
Yeah, is there like one particular story that just comes to mind?
I mean, there are many over the years, because you'd be surprised the amount of systems that have hard-coded the fact that Goto is a reserved keyword. But perhaps the most memorable one, at Google internally, we have something like a URL shortener system called Goto links. And so the way that they work, as you would normally think, is that they have a goto / and then you can pick whatever string you want, and that can point to any URL. And I broke them for about 4 hours at Google. It was fairly early in my career. It was maybe 5 or 6 years in. I was on the Gmail team. This director comes along and says like, hey, every engineer gets a new desktop machine. Just here's a spreadsheet, pick your machine name. And if you don't pick any, I'll just use your username. Happy to get a new machine. And then I just get lazy. It's like just using my username. The moment I plug my machine into the network with the Ethernet cable in, the DNS stuff starts kicking in, register my machine as goto.corp.google.com, and then all of a sudden, all of the Goto links start coming into my machine as opposed to the Goto service. It was actually pretty fast that people realized what the problem was, but it took a long time for the DNS cache to expire. All the Goto links were coming to my machine for a good morning or so. And so for a good amount of time, I kept the company unproductive.
That's like one of those secret pieces of knowledge from Google. I feel like that all the user identifiers are actually email addresses, right? So getting the email address in there had a real impact on that, the URL shortener, right?
And then so many things rely on the username, right? And so the other story that I tell people is that at Google, it's a mono repo. And so everybody submits code to the same repository, and there's a special package called experimental packages that is /experimental /username. And that I broke that too, because mine was obviously experimental /goto, which broke because as soon as you put that into a Java file, it goes into the package name. And so go experimental.goto.package name. And that also doesn't compile because it's a reserved Java keyword. You'd be surprised the amount of systems that people assume that the username is it's a reserve. It's not a reserved keyword.
It seems like you've been destined to be some sort of software engineer breaking systems since you started out. Did you always know that you would go into software engineering and potentially end up at Google for 17 plus years?
I have to say that when I was in 8th grade, I fell in love with computers when I got a Visual Basic book. And I remember that because it was the first time that I read a book faster than my brother. My brother was always the well-put and smart one. I was more the troublemaker, some would say. My curiosity hasn't stopped since 8th grade, and if anything, just grew over time.
How did you end up on the Chrome team working in probably one of the most cutting-edge technologies out there today when it comes to containerization and security, something that everyone's using? You mentioned that you were on the Gmail team before. I can't imagine before getting into Google, you're like, you know what? I want to work on browsers. That's going to be my thing.
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, a long way, and man, I will just show how old I'm feeling now. But I ran into HTML, JavaScript, CSS. I remember just feeling like this permissionless environment. I remember feeling like, as a high schooler, I feel like I can't believe that I'm able to do this without asking for anyone's permission. And I was thinking like a civil engineer required like centuries to like have a bridge approved, or like my parents were doctors, or like there's just no way they would ever operate on anyone without. And I remember this kid, like a 17-year-old, just writing code on the web and just feeling like, man, this feels so wonderful to be able to do stuff without having just not requiring, like a fancy, a lot of economic bootstrap. There's a cinematographer in Brazil that says like all you need to like do some wonderful stuff in film is to have an idea in your head and a camera in your head. And I felt the same way about computers. So I remember building some of my first websites when I was in high school. And I remember in college feeling like that my dream job was to work in Mozilla. My high school idols were folks like Linus and doing the kernel. And in college, it was Mozilla. I've always felt like Mozilla was the perfect job. And Google was just starting along. It was like, I remember, because I went to college in 2002. And so Google was still like in its infancy, but it was already something that people would talk about. At the time, Orkut.com was one of the largest social networks in Brazil. I don't know if Orkut was TikTok before TikTok was cool, or at least the grandfather of TikTok perhaps was Facebook, and then Orkut before that.
I sometimes wonder whether or not, the audience actually thinks that TikTok is cool. So,
Yes, a little debatable, yes. But Orkut was comparable to what TikTok is today. It was a social network, and it was the largest social network in Brazil. Somewhere in the fourth or fifth year of college, I got an internship at Orkut. And I was super excited to come to California. Man, I just can't believe that they let like a 22-year-old like write code for the millions of users and just push things out like to production. And I remember just feeling wonderful about being able to have an effect on Orkut. I would say that maybe my career at Google is maybe divided in three big parts. I would say the first part is like the social network part. So I did Orkut, Google Buzz, part of Google Reader, part of Google Docs, Gmail, and then Google Plus. And at that time, I like to tell people that I was responsible for the least successful version of signing with Google, which I can tell you a little bit about.
I'm with you. Honestly, I think that the cutover from, I think it was Twitter really that started federated login in my book, but it was Google Plus identities, after Wave that really made a huge impact of having the idea of federated login providers out there.
Twitter, a lot of this comes from folks like Brad Fitzpatrick and a lot of the folks that came into Google afterwards. Orkut had some of these ideas too. There was something called Open Social that we tried for a long time. I think it's comparable to what Blue Sky and Mastodon are today, but a way to like have social networks talk to each other. And even at that early stage, I feel like I was already kind of like fascinated by this idea of like having things interoperate with one another. And then after that, the second third of my career at Google was in Google Search. I was like, enough of developing websites, let me try to crawl websites. And then I spent a good 4 or 5 years in Google Search. For the most part, also in doing standards in interoperability. So I did schema.org for like semantic web sprinkles for Google Search. I spent like 10 years of my life building websites, 5 crawling the web. So I figured like at some point I should try to design the web from within it or from the browser. And then so 9 years when I joined the Chrome team and have been developing web platform APIs since.
That's something that at least resonates for me and hopefully some of the listeners as well. And I really like that you brought up the federation story, because I think that's one of the selfish reasons that I wanted to get you on for today's episode, is because I feel like the federated credential management FedCM is such an important innovation in not just the auth space, but really browsers, and getting the word out there that this is now a technology that not only can be used, but companies such as Booking.com and Shopify, I think, are the two canonical examples that have already created support for this. I'm sure you've got like a cornerstone FedCM elevator pitch down. So let's hear it.
I don't know if I do. I think it's funny because I think the way that we talk about it internally is somewhat different than the way that we talk about it externally. But I can tell you at least what's in my heart, at least, which is it's just this intuition that if the browser was more involved with identity, if it took identity as a first-class citizen, then it would be able to assist the user in constructive ways. So like it's just this intuition that of like, in what ways can the browser help the user? And so it's a missing layer in browsers, right? In the internet, that identity is something that is done on top of it as opposed to in it. Federation specifically, both SAML and OAuth, have been done despite of the browser, not because of the browser. Surprised the amount of like workarounds that people have gone through because they assumed that browser vendors were kind of like this immutable thing. I tell people, I understand where they're coming from. Like when I'm designing a browser, I don't think of like, what if I change the laws of gravity? Even operating systems, right? You take the operating system for granted. You don't go like, oh, maybe if only Windows worked that way, or if only Linux worked that way, right? Like you operate with the constraints that you have and in the layer that you're in, and You kind of like, and that's what you have. And for the most part, I think that we went so far in a wonderful way, right? Without the help of the browser. And both SAML and OpenID Connect and OAuth, we also created kind of like really convoluted systems that have different properties, bad properties that just are fundamentally not solvable unless you assume that you can change a layer under it. And so for a good amount of time, I try to go to the identity conferences. IIW nearby happens a lot. And I will tell people, hi, I'm a browser engineer. I'm here to help. I think people assume that browser engineer is done by like completely unrelated people that are, like have five eyes or like three legs, but they're just done by people like the same way that other layers are, and they're as accessible as other layers are. And if you only ask people, how far would you be able to take you if you could assume that the browser could change? And I would just kept asking that question, and people, you'd be surprised the amount of people said, if only the browser could, change this and that way.
I actually want to dive into that because I think the idea of, or it's called the NASCAR problem, comes up, and I think it's worth spending 1 second sort of explaining why. Realistically, it was always the case that in order to select a federated identity provider to log in, the application has to support that specific one. And with the number of data providers that we have out there, or identity providers that are now available, in order to give every user their own control over which identity provider they want to actually use, the list on that login page would have to be, the scroll wheel would have to be involved on the mouse in order to select, and then remembering which identity provider you actually picked. And so for me, I think FedCM is all about eliminating the list, letting the user pick who they log in with, and then most importantly, I think remembering what that choice was.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's also one of my biggest pet peeves. And I try not to run into the same walls that people have already run into. So I talk a lot to the original people that designed some of these things. And they are all kind of like very supportive of, they said, a lot of them say, like, we designed OpenID Connect early on so that you could bring your own. It was just really hard to explain to users. Like you said, right? You either have to have an infinite select box with an infinite scroll, right? But what they actually did was, initially you could enter your OpenID provider in a text box, right? Like you'd enter an email address, right? And then from there, it would like bring in the right things, right? And obviously, like, that was hard for users to understand, right? Who on their right mind say, like, this is my OpenID provider, And they announce themselves as that. And so, like, much as it was a good intention, like the intention of the design, the properties of the system that they wanted was so that you could bring your own, as opposed to have this enumeration of like conceived, pre-anticipated, ahead of time ones. But it turns out that it was just really hard to explain to users in comparison to just clicking on a sign in with Google button or logging with Facebook button, right?
I think now you're actually in a better place to sort of describe the benefits, because we can see, I think what you're describing realistically there is like WebFinger for Mastodon or Matrix.
Yeah.
Or AT Proto there's pretty much just OAuth 2 under the hood for Blue Sky. As a user, you still have to remember what your email address is or your domain every single time you want to log on. And one of my big challenges with even Mastodon is that every time I go there, I'm not on my home domain. I'm on some other domain, and I have to then type in infosec.exchange every single time I want to actually authenticate. And that step just completely goes away. As you brought this up a lot, is that the browser being a layer that's been neglected in a way, and it's become so powerful. One of the flavors to this is that we're seeing more and more attacks that rely on compromising the application layer that's running in the browser, like malicious packages that get in, or we talk about cross-site scripting, XSS, attacks, or injected JavaScript into, browser agents. So even outside of everything else, it makes a lot of sense to start migrating the responsibility of critical components into a more secure layer that doesn't change. Personally, as an auth provider, my company, really anyone who's offering any sort of service, we see that our customers, if they all need to do the same thing, if every application in the world needs to do the same thing, then there's an opportunity to recapture that duplication that every application has to build in, the integration with OpenID or OAuth or AT Proto, et cetera, and move it out to a cornerstone area that it only has to be once. And now only the browsers necessarily have to provide that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree, but it comes at a cost. Ergonomics is a big important factor. Like, not having so many people rewrite the same software thing is useful. But I often tell people that it goes in this order: security, privacy, capabilities, performance, ergonomics, but there's a priority of things. And when you said about both making it useful for developers, I think it's useful. Making it useful, performant for users in not having to remember things, I think is useful too. But I think there's many things that can only be made private if it's like at that layer. A lot of this came from the perspective of there's 7 laws of identity. There's one property of a law, which is justified parties, or data minimization for constrained use, which is that there's just that social login today, as it's currently done, reveals more to parties than it necessarily needs to. And so, as you go along the web and you click on sign in with Google and you click on login with Facebook, both Google and Facebook learns more about what your whereabouts than they necessarily need to. And that's partially because of the construction of the protocol that was used without the browser. But if we introduce the browser, one of the premises was, would it be possible to make it so that you could decouple presentation from issuance, and in doing so, being able to have you go to websites and log into them without phone homing your identity provider. It's a lot less compelling for enterprises and for research and education. But for consumers, we've always felt like, it would be wonderful if you were on the web and that tracking by identity providers weren't a necessary primitive if you provided a better one. So there are many angles as to why FedCM in terms of both ergonomics and NASCAR flag user performance. But I think both the security and privacy aspect, I think, are pretty important too. In performance, I always tell people that I think unification across authentication mechanisms is a key one too. So the browser is the only entity that knows about your passwords and your passkeys, right? But federation has been done on top of the web. And so browsers couldn't really unify everything in a single account user. But if you move them to the kernel, then you can unify those 3 things and offer to the user a meaningful connection. I have 2 accounts on Yelp because Yelp is a product that I use once every 5 years when I need to fix my house. I always forget what did I use the last time that I went to the Yelp, and I end up having 2 accounts. NASCAR flag isn't just the social login providers; it also is the inability of federation to be reconciled with usernames and passwords.
See, and I think historically that's been a requirement on the individual application to deal with that reconciliation. Just in our own product, I know one of the things that our users keep coming back and being we really like this feature is that users, it doesn't matter which mechanism they pick to log in. If the email address is the same, automatically I'll log them in with the previous one. And in consumer applications, as you pointed out, this is critical. And for business applications, you should never do this ever because it's a security risk to even do this and trust whether or not the flag that says email is verified is true or not. I can't imagine just the number of vulnerable applications out there that are vulnerable to data exfiltration by users that logged in with their corporate identity provider, then left the company, still was able to access the email, logged in with the email with a password. The email was never verified, and now can get access back to those systems. And I feel this is just another one of those situations that just completely goes away. I do like that you brought up passkeys, though, because I do want to get to the comparison there. You told me to ask you, what about the cost?
Extensibility Web Manifesto, it's a trade-off between low-level APIs and high-level APIs. It has to do with how much responsibility the operating system pulls for itself. And the more that it does...
States' rights versus, federal union, right?
Well, I guess so. The intuition is, topologically speaking, there are a lot fewer browser engineers than there are website engineers. And so if you count the number of browser engineers, there's maybe maybe a couple thousand in the world. There aren't that many, right? And they're writing C++, and they're busy fighting fires. And so there aren't that many C++ browser engineers. If you count Firefox and Chrome and Safari and whatnot, if you put all of them together, I was just at a meeting last week in Kobe, and so there were fewer than 2,000 people, which doesn't represent everybody, obviously, but it's in that order of magnitude. Web developers, on the other hand, you have millions of web developers, right? And so in terms of innovation and ideas, there's just a lot more brain power in user land than there is in kernel land. So usually browser vendors try to pull as little as they possibly can and enable the ecosystem to do things in user land as much as they possibly can, because it is so much more efficient to do things on top of the browser than inside the browser. And so I always tell people that it's useful to have stuff in the browser when they're boring and uncontroversial. Kind of there's an architectural principle for this, paving the cow paths. So it's the story about an architect. He was tasked to help students walk through the campus. What he proposed was, let's have everything be grass for a couple years, and let's let people walk. And then we'll let them walk, and then whatever there are places where there's a brown patch, we'll pave that, right? as opposed to anticipate what they want to go to and then just have them cut through corners, right? And so that's what they mean by paving the cow paths, which is just let the cows move, right? And then they will move. And then once they move, they will have discovered what is the optimum path from point A to B or where they want to go. And just pave that, right? And so the same way for browser engineering, that's paving the cow path is a term used for kind of like let web developers figure out how to innovate and compete, in this beautiful boiling pot of ideas, right? Where competition and there's just a massive amount of them. And then whenever like things sediment and they settle down and they become boring, bake that into the browser, right? Because once you bake that into the browser, right? Once you pave something, it just stays there forever. Because it's a lot more durable and solidified, right? But it's also not as flexible, right? People walking by places a lot faster than people like paving things. And so the trade-off, yes, it's not always better to have stuff in the browser because once you stick into the browser, it just becomes a lot more ossified. Whereas if you do this on the user land, it's a lot more innovative and it's more exploration. So when things are bubbling and like things are exploring a lot, then it's not very useful to bake that into the browser. That's the trade-off. It's called Accessibility Web Manifesto.
Realistically, what you're doing, no one will adopt the new thing if they don't have to. And if you do break existing websites, no one will adopt the new browser. So you're sort of hosed there. It's interesting you draw that analogy though, because I've always considered engineers to be more like herding cats than cow paths. But maybe that's just my experience.
There's a lot of that too. Yeah, you'd be surprised how much of that there is, for sure.
One of the biggest problems I've seen with browser technology, especially when it comes to optional things, and specifically in the security domain, is first of all, security doesn't like reduce costs. It doesn't people don't actually care about security in a lot of cases. And I have this feeling that passkeys failed, or I'll say WebAuth and FIDO2. There are a lot of things that it's good for. It's pretty much just an evolution of smart cards, though. Second factor attestations and replacing TPMs or HSMs that most desktops and laptops just don't have the ability to have a black box private keys. And I think it's not about the technology because it's great. I think just with that, and hopefully everyone knows what I just said there. And if you don't, I probably have like 20 or 30 blog posts about what those things are. I think the biggest challenge realistically is that the buyers are not the users, right? Like the people that have to actually implement that technology are at companies. And I think you have a similar problem with the application development today with FedCM, whereas you need to convince all four sides of your platform to start picking up this technology, right? You have the end users and you have the browsers, you have auth providers, and you have the application. Some people really want this, right? I think everyone will jump up and down, especially me saying, FedCM, best thing ever. As a user, I want this, yesterday. All the browsers support it, et cetera. But if you look at the internet ecosystem, there's still something like 50% of websites on the internet are still being run on WordPress. And I don't know if I trust this number anymore because WordPress is the one, pushing it. But even if it's remotely correct, I think the biggest challenge there is how do we convince the application developer teams and really their companies to do this migration, do this change, and support this new technology, which will really be better for everyone?
Man, that's a really tough question, and I can't say that I have a perfect answer, but I can tell you that I've spent a absurd and unreasonable amount of time thinking about it, and that my strategy is at a minimum deliberate. So, but it's hard to say if it's going to work or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I should just give up and give you the convoluted way. The strategy so far, which I think is a reasonable strategy. So it's based on a essay by one of our internal strategists. He left Google recently, a couple of years ago. He called this the self-sustaining flame. I would say it's a ecosystem strategy, which is in opposition to what Alex Komorowski called the flamethrower. Typical compositional play was that we would come up with something, and then we would go at Google I/O, and then we would just throw a flamethrower at something and say like, use this. Right. And like that happened for things like Dart, Wave. That is one ecosystem strategy, is to come up with something and then just throw a flamethrower using the loudest flamethrower that you can possibly have. And Google I/O is probably one of the largest that Google has. And the self-sustaining flame was it had to do with feedback loops. And find a way to have the feedback loop feed it back in a constructive way. So set up a feedback loop. And so his premise was, instead of like throwing a flamethrower, because a flamethrower like goes very fast and it burns the thing, but then it kind of like goes down afterwards. Instead of that, do this instead. Find like a minimal viable audience for something that you need. And then from that, start building an ecosystem in such a way that the more entities you start engaging with, start providing value, the bigger this becomes, and then the more it will pull other people into. But FedCM operates a similar way, which is, like I said, I was the tech lead for signing with Google like 15 years ago. And so I figured, what would happen if I was able to have been the tech lead for signing with Google 15 years ago and kind of like know a lot of the people and also be able to change the client, what would happen, if I could do both, right? And so for the most part, we did Chrome and signing with Google in a way such that we asked ourselves, let's do this such that it creates a gravity well, but let's make it so that any other browser could take advantage of this too, and any identity provider could take advantage of this too. We figured out a way to redeploy signing with Google without asking for the rely parties to change. The way that signing with Google is deployed across these many websites is that they embed a JavaScript SDK that the website embeds in pools and the user pools dynamically, right? And so we said, well, what if we have the JavaScript SDK call FedCM as opposed to do a top-level redirect? So that they could call FedCM into this. And so we spent like a year and a half testing technical feasibility. And at some point we convinced ourselves, we think we can deploy this across every website in the world that uses the JavaScript SDK that Sign with Google does without just changing the browser, just changing the identity provider. And so today, if you fast forward from that initial intuition to today, and about 3% of the websites on the web uses calls into FedCM just because we managed to deploy that over JavaScript SDKs. The vast majority of the web uses FedCM in terms of websites that you go to. There isn't any that you can go to that wouldn't have an integration apart from banks and healthcare providers. But from a consumer perspective, there isn't anywhere on the web that you can go with Chrome that you wouldn't be able to take advantage of FedCM because both Chrome and the IDP and the JavaScript SDK changed. And that created that we hope, right, that created the beginnings of a self-sustaining flame. And so Shopify came along, and then in a similar, but different, they don't use JavaScript SDK the same way, but in a similar way, they were able to deploy FedCM across all of their merchants. And there are hundreds of thousands of merchants that Shopify supports, right? And then PayPal came along, email providers are coming along in terms of email providers. And then Firefox is coming along. Firefox has always been very supportive of FedCM. Safari has always been also supportive, but also kind of like a little bit more cautious about like how it relates to other stuff. And so, but we never got anyone from Safari saying like, this is like directionally incorrect.
Since the integration in Chrome and soon to be Firefox is supporting FedCM, applications that support login with Google are actually already using FedCM to authenticate and letting the users log in. Does that mean that without any changes on the application side, users that bring their own identity provider or other identity providers that are supporting FedCM can already be used to log into those same websites?
The limit to how much backwards incompatible things you can do, and it's the case that we have been able to deploy signing with Google for the most part in a backwards compatible way. The application server, though, that is harder to redeploy at scale. Every application has to redeploy individually for it to enable things that go beyond a signing with Google integration or a signing with Shopify integration, right? Except that Shopify controls both the ERP, the application, and the identity provider, so they're able to augment it with things like you suggested, like being able to bring your own, right? But it's not true that you can like out of a sudden just redeploy all the applications and provide all the features that you want to provide them. There's a limit to that.
The relying party is just the application running in the browser. So the problem, I think, realistically is it's not replacing the mechanism by which you're consuming the JWTs, the JOTs that are coming from the identity providers. Those are still exactly the same. The only difference is the user experience that causes those tokens to get generated, which means that realistically, as an application maintainer or developer, the thing to do is not change any of your technology, but change your assumptions on where those tokens can be generated from. And it's still a real problem that you'll need to figure out, okay, if the token came from Google, how to verify tokens from accounts google.com/OAuth, or the tokens came from somewhere else. So likely you still need some attention there. However, I will say that if you're using some sort of identity aggregator, so either not to say that my product's the best in the world, but if you're using Authoress, that solves it for you. If you're using Fusion Auth or Auth0, potentially they have solutions as well that automatically do this aggregation for FedCM-based providers, which means that if you are using an identity aggregator and you didn't just log in with Google yourself or log in with Shopify, you already have this capability of providing this functionality to your users in a in a way that's completely transparent to your applications as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the next trick to play. Like we played a trick with JavaScript SDKs that I think was pretty cute. But I think the next trick to play, I call these frameworks. I don't know if that's the right term, but yeah, for sure, like your company, right? All these companies that provide auth services for other companies, right? Have the ability to like change so many applications just by changing that one entry point. It all has to do with leverage. WordPress accounts for like 50% of the web. That to me is actually good news, because that means that we can just go to WordPress and say like, hey, do you mind like supporting FedCM up from the get-go, right?
Good luck with that.
50% of the web, right?
I mean, I only say that because like they don't even have their own like sign-in widget for federated identity providers. You need to first install like a third-party plugin to make that happen. But I'm sure if you search for the WordPress plugin store right now, there's already a FedCM, identity provider plugin. Yeah. I know, we have one, and Auth0's got one, and et cetera. So that's just one way to make the WordPress stuff just work out of the box.
Not using FedCM would just be a competitive disadvantage.
Yeah. Well, I love this. So, it's coming for us and our users specifically. I still think the selling point actually is out of the application developer hands. It's in the business organizations that are deciding where to put their development resources. So the question, at the end of the day becomes, if you're using one of these open source frameworks or you're using a SaaS provider, what is the complexity for validation, for testing? What is the configuration required? I know for open source stuff is a little bit of a challenge. You have to probably upgrade 5 semantic versions and deal with the breaking backwards compatible changes. But for SaaS providers, you click a checkbox and you're ready to go. I think that we didn't really touch on it, but it's worth reiterating. One of the things that really comes down here, I feel like, is the user experience. Like if we're improving anything here, it's the UX over security or ease of development or anything like that.
User first, developer second, browser engines third, and technical purity fourth. And you'll be surprised how often that needs to be said, because you'll be surprised how much technical purity comes first. But users first is for sure is what I think most of myself included is most obsessed about in FedCM's design, which is how do you provide like a really good, compelling user experience? It just is the role of the browser is to make it so that it serves the user for the most part.
I think it's a long time coming, honestly, because the more control, especially with authentication, that moves out of the application land into browser, really prevents vulnerabilities in the number one attack vector of all time, which is social engineering through phishing attacks. And by moving that out, you pretty much are it's not a direct elimination, because of course people can still fake what is being shown there and displayed, but eventually there's no way that browsers will allow applications to make real changes to the outside that window, as you mentioned. Because historically it was the case a long time ago, right? Browsers allowed websites to make change to the URL bar, to the back button, right? Like even that's gone out the window. You can't really stop, back pushing or blocking navigation. There used to be a thing about pop-ups. Safari does this really annoying thing where if you wait too long before making a page switch or a URL change, it blocks the action, saying that the user didn't cause it, to try to prevent, pop-up explosion. So I really do hope that there's more configuration that to come with the interactions with the browser from the application land. The number one thing that's always on my mind is, can we get access to the TPM?
Oh, for sure. Have you run into DBSC?
So I tried engaging with DBSC. So DBSC is the device-bound session credentials. And the idea is pretty fantastic, that it locks away token session continuation into the browser. My problem with it is that it doesn't solve any attack vector that I care about.
It addresses cookie theft, right?
Well, yeah, but only after the session's been started. So the real problem is that you can force cookie regeneration, a new login, as a malicious attacker anytime you want, and then control that session instead. And realistically, I want a way for the whole OAuth or OpenID or SAML process to happen without the application being able to do anything about it, or access to the TPM in a way that can secure the credentials. And DBSC doesn't solve that for me. So I love FedCM. I really hope that there's a strategy. Access to the TPM will get it for me, because that will allow us to verify, like basically fingerprint the devices and ensure that they're secure and that the credentials are never taken away. And it allows us to do really interesting things where we can bind the JWTs that are generated to the actual device. Whereas what's happening right now is with DBSC, the JWTs aren't being bound to the device. They're being bound to an area of the browser which is not accessible by the application. And while it's nice, it would be really nice to have something like a delegated proof of possession. And I'm going to use some like complicated OAuth 2 stuff here. So anyone who's not following, don't worry about it. That's just me from the OAuth 2 working group that, is paying attention. That allows you to restrict who can actually use those JWTs, and allowing you to restrict them to the specific device is really critical. And I would really like to see someday like the spiritual successor to DBSC, where the browser is starting the auth flow, it's ensuring device credentials, it's signing tokens with the TPM, the onboard, black box private key to ensure that the communication is actually tamper-proof.
At least I can give you a sense of that. Something that we're working on is called delegated FedCM. Have you run a delegation-oriented FedCM? But it's kind of like a three-party model, like a issuer, holder, verifier model, the SD-JOTs.
I've seen SD-JOTs mostly for, I think the canonical use case, especially in Europe, is like you want to get into, obviously no one cards you at a bar here, but in the United States, just as an example, you want to get into a bar and there's an age limit, you got to be 21 or older. You shouldn't have to tell everyone who you are in order to verify that you're holding a credential that verifies your age. And so basically the issuer is the government institution, the verifier is of course the device that the bar is holding, and you as the user contain that credential and can just pass the necessary part over.
That's roughly it, but for social login, I think. The feature, like I said, it would be wonderful if we could make it so that you could log into websites without phone homing your identity provider. The reason I bring it up is because the browser is for the first time, like actually signing something. It's taking something that gets issued by an identity provider and then gets presented by the browser, and so in doing so, we are going to be signing things. And so having it be like bound to a TPM, for example, could be an incremental step for us.
Yeah, I think it's the other direction. Like I don't particularly care if so you mentioned Google, et cetera. So one of the biggest concerns with logging in with Google everywhere that people have often is exposing to Google that they've logged in. Now, I don't believe Google does anything useful with this information whatsoever. But if you were logging with Facebook, they are for sure using that data for malicious practices. And maybe I shouldn't say that. I believe they're using it for malicious practices. It's my opinion. I have no evidence. Let me get that on record right there. And so no one will challenge me specifically. But I think that's really the problem. And I actually am more concerned about providing my email address to the individual applications, because they're going to take and turn around and sell it, or they're just going to have a data leak where someone gets it anyway. And now I get spam in German all the time because, I live in Switzerland, so why not? And I know someone sold my data, sold my email address, and I would really love to just be able to have infinite aliases for email addresses. And FedCM solves this for me because I can spin up my own identity provider or using our product and create dynamic aliases, which are provided to the individual application. I don't need an extra level here for delegation, et cetera, or passing it along. I think with FedCM, you've solved my biggest concern with browser authentication, user identity management for applications, and honestly, the last 20 years.
I would love if that was true. I'm certainly it won't be for the lack of trying. I'm glad that you're finding it to be of your service. And yeah, I'm super excited to see. It's hard to say. We have tried this. There's like 100,000 dev bodies before me, but I just know that it probably went farther than most people have in that specific mission. But still a bit too soon to know if we're not going to run into another wall. But it won't leave me for the lack of trying.
Yeah, and I think it will live, and it won't just perish. So it will be there in the browsers, and as long as it actually gets out in Firefox, then I think we can be sure that it's going to have a long-lived history there. Especially now that there's no Internet Explorer, and Edge or Quantum or whatever they're calling it is built on top of Chromium as well. We have FedCM, on the Microsoft side as well.
Firefox has always been very supportive. Because so much of it is inspired by personas. They were ahead of their time, I think, in many ways, or perhaps doing it the wrong company, perhaps. They didn't have a big identity provider at the time, close by that they could work with. And so Firefox has always been very supportive, but having philosophical alignment is already like 80% of the way, I think things just converge. Like if it's just execution, they would at some point converge. And I think to a large extent, I also feel that way with the Safari engineers. Almost everybody that I talk to, they're like, yeah, this seems directionally correct, and we just don't know. We were just partially waiting for you. A lot of people are skeptical if we can pull this off. To some extent, I'm still also am not confident about it. And so I do feel that it at some point converges, but it won't come for free. It would just be hard work that we'll do one step at a time, and at some point go to get there.
If anyone who works at Safari or Firefox, wants to come on the podcast and, share the whole story and architecture and complexity there, I'm all for it. Definitely. I think, as you said, because it's a four-sided platform, you do need each side to sort of sign up for it. But the fact that basically applications and identity providers and users have all gone full in with this, it's just a matter of having all the browsers there and Chromium driving Chrome and Edge there. It really is just Firefox, which I think is gonna convert. And then we have this technology, and this, like I said, I think it's a huge success. One thing I do want to make sure that I get out of you, though, is you said you were at I think it's the largest browser conference in the world this year, right?
It's called TPAC. It's very technical. It's for browser engineers or browser vendors. So it's very technical that way.
What's coming down the pipeline there?
It's like an annual conference where it's the biggest one from the WWDC, where all the browser people go, not just browser engineers, but just across, product management, UX design, UXR, and engineering. But it's very technical in many ways. And it's usually has, for the most part, representation of browser vendors, but also developers. And so you have Safari, Edge, Mozilla, Chrome, Opera, Vivaldi, all the browser vendors there, Brave. Like trying to find, I tell my family at least, the way they describe to them, it sounds like a UN convention, a United Nations convention, where each country sends their diplomat there to try to find, because it's like everybody there cares about the web. So it's like the web against the world in that way. So like they obviously have their own companies, and each browser vendor have their own angles, right? In terms of, they don't always agree on things in terms of privacy, where to draw the line of security, inconvenience, and so on. But they're all like passionate about the web. They all want to defend the web. And so that we have in common. And it's a whole week. It was in Kobe, Japan this year. It fluctuates between North America and no North America, and people, like, they're passionate about the web. They live and breathe the web. They want to help the web, and they all go to the same hotel where they sleep in the fourth floor, and then they work in the rooms, and it's like a science camp in that way. And so the hallway and the dinners and the breakfasts is where I would say most of the work gets done. And I have to say that, like, the discussions, they fluctuate as the year goes by. If you think about, like, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, blockchain was probably dominating a bunch of stuff, But if you go all the way back to, like, 2008, 2009, it was a lot the rise of native apps like iOS and Apple and Android's Play Store, and like how does the web compete with those walled gardens? A few years ago it was the social web. It was the rise of Facebook, and how do we make it so that Facebook doesn't like entirely make the web a walled garden? So, but it's I would say with confidence that this year it was a lot about AI. Just a lot of people were just, I think it's like one of the most insane things that we've done in the world as humankind. And most people was like, oh yeah, there was a spectrum of like, man, we're going to die, to like, man, this is beautiful. And so AI was very polarizing, as most good things are, or most bad things are. And I think AI was probably the hot topic. And I felt, at least, that it was beautiful because the period between 2008 and 2016 was the rise of native apps, Android and iOS apps. It's like all the VC funding was going there. And I remember a time where people were like, is the web going to survive, right? Because it was a really dark period that a lot of people said, maybe the web's going to die, or maybe we don't, that was a good ride, but are we going to need it anymore? The time that we're in right now is like this AI thing where everybody's asking, no, my AI browser is better than your AI browser. Or like my AI protocol is better than your MCP is better than A2A and whatnot, right? More so than like, does the web even have a role here? So it was different vibe, but I think in many ways more optimistic than a few years ago.
Has the building of walled gardens, I think a lot of the data is being sequestered behind these. Like we can see that the Reddits of the world, even Google search is limited in what it has access to, and that the data has almost priceless. Like these companies don't even want to sell what they have, instead use it to train up LLMs, et cetera. Has that had a big impact on the direction that you may have, or your thoughts on where a browser such as Chromium would go in the future?
A lot of people are kind of like, how do we monetize the web going forward?
Unfortunately.
Like people producing content, like for for example, yourself pushing a podcast out, right? You have to pay rent. If you live in Zurich, your rent is probably really high. A lot of people create content not for the sake of like paying the bills, but like because they actually want the content to be out, but which is perfectly fair. But it is true that things need to be economically viable for them to be viable at all. And so for better or for worse, but ads has like for the most part like funded a lot of the content creation on the web, right? With subscriptions being like the opposite monetization strategy. So in ads has all this different set of problems of like, but the challenge is that for the last few years with search engines, a lot of the content production on the web has already been hard to monetize. There's a sentiment that it will get harder as we get into LLMs, and I think everybody is hoping that we'll find a way in which the web will remain healthy and prosperous.
I like the sentiment, both optimistic and realistic at the same time. I think that may be a good moment before we get too much into the philosophy of that to switch over to picks for the episode. So Sam, what did you bring for us today?
Just so that people have something to anchor on something concrete. I subscribe a lot to the 7 Laws of Identity that King Cameron published, along with many other people. I abide to a lot of those principles, and that has guided a lot of my work. But just more career-wise, perhaps, I ran into The Egg by Andy Weir, which I thought was pretty cool, and I think that helped me a bunch.
I find it's really interesting because I also liked The Egg, and what I had read this probably like at the dawn of the internet, because it's quite old at this point, right? And I never realized that much later I then read The Martian and Hail Mary, and whatever the one is that's on the moon, and I didn't realize it was the same author.
Yeah, that caught me by surprise too.
Yeah, it's just such great, and the Egg is like pretty short. It's a short story, right?
Very short. So yeah, so it's for one, it's easy to read. Like it will take you less than 2 minutes. 2 is very entertaining. And 3, I think it can really open your mind. If you don't mind me making concrete, I can tell you how it helped me, specifically when it comes to ecosystem building and so on. I feel a lot of things for a lot of people. Since I ran into that, I figured, oh, wait, what if I'm that other person too? And so like when I'm running to like at TPAC just last week, I ran into a bunch of people that, I love working with, but they are hard, smart people that are stubborn as hell. And I'm also stubborn as hell. And like, but if you think about them as if they were you think of them as like, wait, I see where they're coming from, that they're trying something different from a different perspective. Helping them is helping myself. The way that I think of this is in terms of rationality and reductionism is that if you think about a cell, right, like a unicellular life, right, like a cell at some point duplicates into 2 with mitosis, right? And the point of like when the cell breaks into 2 and it's like a well-known thing, which one is the original one, or are they both the same? And so like Warren, yourself, you're like sitting like in Zurich, and Mountain View, like we're so far apart, but like we can almost trace both of our life choices as something trying different things, right? And that in as much as I can agree or disagree with you, I just feel like both you and I are just the same in that, but coming from different perspectives. That has helped me, actually get work done.
It's very reminiscent of the concept that comes up in, there's actually a character in Invincible, the comic book and show, which is very good. And The Prestige, it comes up as well, like who is the original. And if anyone's interested, the Conway's Game of Life, the little cells that are organized by a simple equation to drive the next state from the current one, is this idea that every single place in the universe is governed by the same equation. And there's no fundamental difference between individual cells from each other or different people. So I really like the perspective. Always good to bring. I don't think anyone ever said that we needed more philosophy in software engineering. But in case you're just driven by the day-to-day tasks and don't ever get the enjoyment of fighting about like variable names, here's one more step on top of it of like how you actually work effectively. So I love those picks. Thanks, Sam. So I guess I got to share mine. I thought a lot before today's episode, and I thought the thing that could be relevant is the Platform Revolution book, How Network Markets Are Transforming the Economy. It's by Jeffrey Parker, and I use it. I think it says a lot of things like what is a platform, like a multi-sided platform and not necessarily like an engineering platform or a development platform. And it shaped a lot of how I think about how entities work together or against each other in building a platform with many different sided entities with their own ideology and what they actually want to do and how to extract value there. I shared earlier in this episode that when you have a product and all your users need to do the same thing and it's a not value added activity, you should question, why are we making the users do that? Especially when all of them need to do that thing. If all of your users need to log in or design their own login strategy for their browser, you get a question like, why are we making them do that? Now, maybe it's you don't have the resources to build every feature known to humankind into the browser so that applications just are a configuration file or a YAML file. But there is really something novel there that I particularly like, and it has driven a lot of my thinking around.
Yeah, for sure. Have you run into the master switch?
I've heard of it. I haven't yet.
It has to do with platforms and how a lot of them tend to centralize. It should also give you a sense of like of the effort, of the deliberate effort of keep having things be more open, comes at a cost. But yeah, that's a good. Did you say Platform Revolution?
Yeah, the Platform Revolution by Jeffrey Parker. The link will, like always, will be in the description. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure, Sam. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with us about FedCM and Chrome and your experiences at Google. This has been great. I know you're just here on behalf of yourself, so I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to make this happen.
Yeah, for sure. It was a pleasure talking to you too.
Well, thank you. And thanks for all the listeners for jumping in for this episode. And hopefully we'll see you all back next week.